I should be presenting this. Everybody is hearing? Okay. Stand up, but there's no place to be stand up and reading. So I'm sorry if I'm seated, but I'll try to do my best to speak to you in an attractive way. Okay? If you are not, if you can see the pictures, you can move to the front, okay, and it will be easier for you to watch it. First of all, I'd like to thank you, Gabriela, for inviting me. This is my first speech since 30 years. I was one of the founders of the Instituto de Estudos Empresariais and also Instituto Liberdade, but since 25 years ago I stopped working with this liberty business for everybody else, but I was studying all the time, and since 2 years ago I was invited to come back to work at Instituto de Estudos Empresariais, and after that Gabriela was trying to invite me to be here, and now I am here, okay? Well, let's start the presentation. Oh, my presentation will be about language, and which for me is the code to live. In 1877, Lord Acton, the English historian, politician, and writer, made a speech where he said, "Liberty, next to religion, has been the motive of good deeds and the common pretext of crime. From the sowing of the seed at Athens, 2,460 years ago, until the ripened harvest was gathered by men of our race, it is the delicate fruit of a mature civilization. And scarcely a century has passed since nations that knew the meaning of the term resolved to be free. In every age, its progress has been beset by its natural enemies, by ignorance and superstition, by lust of conquest and by love of ease, by the strong man's craving for power and the poor man craving for food. During long intervals, it has been utterly arrested, and nations were being rescued from barbarism and from the grasp of strangers. And when the perpetual struggle for existence, depriving man of all interest and understanding politics, has made them eager to sell their birthright for a pottage, and ignorant of treasure they resign. At all times, sincere friends of freedom have been rare, and its triumphs have been due to minorities that have prevailed by associating themselves with auxiliaries whose objects often differ from their own. And this association, which is always dangerous, has been sometimes disastrous, by giving to opponents just grounds of opposition, and by kindling dispute over the spoils in the hour of success. No obstacle has been so constant or so difficult to overcome as uncertainty and confusion touching the nature of liberty. If hostile interests have wrought much injury, false ideas have wrought still more, and its advance is recorded in the increase of knowledge as much as in the improvement of laws. In 1944, Friedrich Hayek, the Austrian economist and philosopher, published his book, The Road to Serfdom, where we can read, "It is a common mistake to regard National Socialism as a mere revolt against reason, a rational movement without intellectual background. If that were so, the movement would be much less dangerous than it is. But nothing could be further from the truth or more misleading. The doctrines of National Socialism are the culmination of a long revolution of thought, a process in which thinkers who have had great influence far beyond the confines of Germany have taken part. Wherever one may think of the premises from which they started, it cannot be denied that the men who produced the new doctrines were powerful writers, who left the impress of their ideas on the wall of European thought. Their system was developed with ruthless consistency. Once one accepts the premises from which it starts, there is no escape from its logic. It is simple collectivism, freed from all traces of an individualist tradition, which might hamper its realization." In 1946, George Orwell, the English novelist, essayist, journalist, and critic, author of 1984, his dystopian book, published in 1949, wrote in his essay Politics and the English Language, "In our time, political speech and writing are largely the defense of the indefensible. Things like the continuance of a British rule in India, the Russian purge and deportations, the dropping of atom bombs on Japan can indeed be defended, but only by arguments which are too brutal for most people to face, and which do not square with the professed aims of political parties. Thus, political language has to consist largely of euphemism, question begging, and sheer cloudy vagueness. Defenseless villages are bombed from the air, the inhabitants driven out into the countryside, the cattle machine gun, the huts set on fire with incendiary bullets. This is called pacification. Millions of peasants are robbed of their farms and sent trudging along the roads with no more than they can carry. This is called transfer of population, or rectification of frontiers. People are imprisoned for years without trial, or shot in the back of the neck, or sent to die of scurvy in the Arctic lumber camps. This is called elimination of unreliable elements. Such phraseology is needed if one wants to name things without calling up mental pictures of them. Consider, for instance, some comfortable English professor defending Russian totalitarianism. He cannot say outright, "I believe in killing off your opponents," when you can get good results by doing so. Probably, therefore, he will say something like this: while freely conceding that the Soviet regime exhibits certain features which the humanitarian may be inclined to deplore, we must, I think, agree that a certain curtailment of the right to politician opposition is an unavoidable concomitant of transitional periods, and that the rigors which the Russian people have been called upon to undergo have been amply justified in the sphere of concrete achievement. In 1957, Ayn Rand, a Russian-American philosopher and novelist, published Atlas Shrugged, where she wrote several passages about communication as a weapon. Let me read one of the John Galt's messages to his allies, denouncing what would be anti-reason characters' intentions. Their goal is not the era of pre-science, but the era of pre-language. Their purpose is to deprive you of the concept on which man's mind, his life, and his culture depend, the concept of an objective reality. In 2004, Stephen Hicks, an American philosopher and professor, published Exploring Postmodernism, and raised some questions and presented some answers to it. Why has a leading segment of the political left adopted skeptical and relativist epistemological strategies? Language is the center of postmodern epistemology. Moderns and postmoderns differ not only about content, when arguing particular issues in philosophy, literature, and law. What is language's connection to reality, and what is its connection to action? Epistemological questions about language are a subset of epistemological questions about consciousness in general. What is consciousness' connection to reality, and what is its connection to action? Moderns and postmoderns have radically different answers to those questions. For the modern realists, consciousness is both cognitive and functional, and those two traits are integrated. The primary purpose of consciousness is to be aware of reality. The complementary purpose of consciousness is to use its awareness as a guide to acting in that reality. For the postmoderns and anti-realists, by contrast, consciousness is functional, but it is not cognitive. So its functionality has nothing to do with cognition. Having said that, in order to avoid uncertainty or confusion, euphemism, question begging, and sheer clouded vagueness, most important, in order to avoid taking you to a pre-language stage, or worst, to a stage where language is absolutely disconnected from reality, I would like to define some concepts in an objective way, answering three simple questions. What is information? Etymologically, information derives from the Latin verb informare, means obviously to inform, in the sense of to give form to the mind, to discipline, to instruct, to teach. Furthermore, the Latin word informatio means concept or idea. This concept of mind's formation brings us to Maria Montessori, one of the most influenced educators of last century. She was an Italian physician who created around 1907 the educational method that bears her name. Montessori explained the importance of education as a method where children should be stimulated to use awareness by their own, learning from reality through experience and interaction. In her words, the first idea the child must acquire is that of the difference between good and evil. This is also the purpose of this seminar, to help us to find out what is good and what is evil in the realm of the ideas. This year, the theme proposed by this third seminar is Liberty in the Information Age. This title suggests to me that information is a recent phenomenon, perhaps a product of our time. Well, actually, it's not. What is a product of our time is the impressive multitude of methods to explore, acquire, analyze, transform and share information as a value, either for good or for evil. The information age supposedly started hundreds of thousands of years ago, probably when the very first Homo sapiens on Earth started to use reason as a survival tool. Like our babies today, he opened his eyes to see the light, sharpened his ears to listen to noises, cleared his nose to smell the aroma, tasted things to perceive their flavor, and touched his feet to feel it. We as rational beings demand information all the time, since the beginning of our time in this planet. Our species is provided with senses to let us observe, to interact, to communicate with reality, with the natural world that surrounds us and to which we belong. Man acquires knowledge by observing what exists through his five senses, builds concepts and principles based on what he perceives, validating ideas by confronting them with reality, resolving contradictions through logic, and revealing thoughts. This is the method used by scientists to discover the facts of reality, to create principles and ideas, which will provide the values to facilitate our lives, enhancing our existence. This is how inventors create products. Businessmen produce and distribute goods. Physicians diagnose, treat, or cure diseases. Musicians compose songs. Artists paint possible or impossible utopias. Children learn language, math, or manners. And philosophers uncover the nature of the universe, the nature of man, morals, politics, and aesthetics. Reason Sorry about that. Reason is the means by which everyone learns about the world, about yourself, about our needs, and how to satisfy them properly. All human knowledge begins with information. Where, when, who, why, how much, how many. Trillions of questions and answers exchanged by billions of individuals, or by yourself. represents more than the flux of information. It's the flux of life, only possible to humans due to language. It's the result of observation, sensory perception, logical inference, integration. The fundamental tool we have developed to connect reality with our cognitive and functional consciousness is language. Language is the key code to set us free. What is language? The first and most basic conclusion, the indivisible fact, the absolute truth, the starting point to analyze the world and life is axiomatic, consists only of the idea that existence exists. The existence is the broader concept we can understand. It embraces all things that exist. A second fundamental axiom is the faculty to perceive what exists, awareness, consciousness. Consciousness is another uncontroversial and irreducible axiom. Existence and consciousness are inescapable primaries and lead into a third axiom, derived from these two. Identity. The law of identity states that if there's something, this thing is the sum of particular peculiar attributes and characteristics in a way that this specific thing is the same with itself and different from another. Derived from the concept of identity comes the concept of entity. Entity is everything that exists. Therefore, entity is everything that has an identity. Entities are subject to categorization, applies to them qualities, quantities, relationships, and specific actions. Nothing can be something and be something else at the same time. Be it an object, an attribute, an action, or whatever that has existed, exists, or comes into being. As Aristotle concludes, A equals A. The law of causality, a law of identity's corollary, states that every action is the action of an entity. No actions arise out of nowhere. Every effect is due to a cause, and every cause connects to an entity that has a certain identity. Every entity has a specific nature, which can be contradicted. Promoted the action will result in effects closely related to the nature of that entity. An entity can act contrary to his nature. This is the law of causality. In the words of Ayn Rand again, language is a code of visual auditory symbols that serves the psycho-epistemological function of converting concepts into the mental equivalent of concrete. Language is the exclusive domain and tool of concepts. Every word we use, with the exception of proper names, is a symbol that denotes a concept. In this case, that stands for an unlimited number of concretes of a certain kind. Concepts are therefore language. Concepts and therefore language are primarily a tool of cognition, not of communication, as is usually assumed. Communication is merely the consequence, not the cause, not the primary purpose of concept formation. A crucial consequence of invaluable importance to man, but is still only a consequence. Cognition precedes communication. The necessary precondition of communication is that one has something to communicate. The primary purpose of concepts and of language is to provide man with a system of cognitive classification and organization, which enables him to acquire knowledge on an unlimited scale. This means to keep order in man's mind and enable him to think. Language is a product of man's mind will to serve our necessity for knowledge due to our epistemological nature. Since we are not equipped with any automatic system which could provide us instinctive answers to sustain our lives. Since our organisms do not have the ability to keep us alive without understanding what is good and what is bad for us as a living being, we need to keep and categorize information as a basic source of an objective value to maintain us healthy, functional, to let us enjoy life and what it can offer to us. Francis Bacon once said, "Nature, to be commanded, must be obeyed. To obey nature and command it, we need information. We need to use inductive and scientific methods to form concepts and ideas, which will lead our actions into the task of preserving our life through production and commerce in a free market, and promoting better standards to our living on earth or elsewhere through innovation." In 2010, Deirdre McCloskey, the American economist, proposed that Industrial Revolution, the movement that stopped timeless stagnation, occurred due to a cultural revolution, probably an Enlightenment legacy, which consists basically in the way how the people started to see and praise businessmen and innovators. She understood what really created this hockey stick format chart. It was not exploitation or zero-sum exchanges, which creates no value, only switches wealth from one hand to another. Neither were capital accumulation or investment or commercialization, among other initiatives. The greatest positive externality of all time according to McCloskey and also to the Yale economist William Norhaus, is innovation. However, innovation only flourishes in a friendly environment where businessmen, entrepreneurs of all kinds, mainly innovators, should be seen as heroes instead of being despised as robbers or exploiters by those who prefer to hail the state, as we have been watching. The intermediary result is this gigantic regulation and taxation obsession, demanded and supported by those who believe in the culture of collectivism. The final result will be undesirable. Now, what we have seen since Enlightenment was a vigorous attack by those thinkers Hayek denounced, as I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation. We have seen detours in our way to prosperity, inescapable exits leading us to the road of serfdom. We can detach ourselves from reality, we can evade behind ignorance, superstition, mystification, fallacies, and misconceptions. We can despise information. We can pervert concepts. We can transform language into a tool of destruction. Soon we'll see decadence. We will regress to the state of poverty as we did several times in the past. People like us, defenders of truth and liberty, must be vigilant and fight back. If we do not take the wheel driving out from the road of serfdom, we know our destination. Unless we stand firmly for those principles that have taken us out from historical stagnation, endemic starvation, epidemic diseases, endless wars, outrageous slavery, principles such as the supremacy of reality over subjective consciousness, reason over faith, self-interest, long-term egoism over altruism, self-sacrifice, or the sacrifice of others, individualism over collectivism, rule of law over authoritarianism, long-term happiness over nihilistic or hedonistic short-term pleasure culture, which enjoys consuming but despises those who innovate or create value from nothing but their own minds. And finally, liberty over coercion. What is liberty? Liberty is one of the corollary rights derived from the fundamental right to life every man has. Liberty is the right every man has to act in accordance to his own judgment, free from compulsion or coercion initiated by others. to create the means to sustain, promote, fulfill and enjoy his life. By means, I'm referring to property rights, intellectual or not. Property is the only right to action capable to guarantee liberty and consequentially the right to life. Having rights is not being entitled to any good, tangible or intangible, which you may need but we don't have. We have rights only over what we already have. Now, why we call the seminar language of liberty and we have to speak only in English? Liberty is or was high valued in several places around the world. People from different cultures and languages used to promote or at least to defend liberty as well. Why don't we speak in Sumerian? About 4,500 years ago, in the southern part of what today is Iraq, there was a society called Sumer. The Sumerians were the first people to invent a written language system. They were very creative. They invented several tools such as wheel, cuneiform script, arithmetic and geometry, irrigation systems, boats, lunisolar calendar, saws, chisels, hammers, braces, everything. They also developed the first law system with a government, bureaucracy, and judges. According to some studies, the first symbol to conceive to represent liberty, the first symbol conceived to represent liberty as a concrete was the word Amagi, coined by the Sumerians. Sumerian could be the language of liberty today? Of course not. Their language and their culture do not even exist anymore. They disappeared 4,000 years ago. Why we are not speaking in Phoenician? Phoenicians, about 3,000 years ago, made substantial contributions to our civilization. They created the first phonetic alphabet, which replaced the Sumerian cuneiform script with obvious advantages. They were a very entrepreneurial people. They established the trade routes in the Mediterranean, giving shape to the earliest example of a world economy. They had an organized society with an oligarchical government subject to some kind of democratic system, working in the same way like a republic. They built cities along the Mediterranean, introducing cooperation through commerce in the region. They had a strong influence over the Greek culture and politics. But like Sumerians, they also disappeared after losing several wars against Persians, Macedonians, and Romans. Why Greek is not the language of liberty? Athens can be considered the birth of Western civilization. Homer in literature, Thales, Euclid, Hippocrates, and Archimedes in science, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, among other philosophers, shaped our culture. Also politicians like Solon and Pericles are still influencing the world with their ideas and actions. Athenians were the first people to understand the importance of individual freedom. They were the first organized society to establish a system of political relationship in a social context based on the individual as the ultimate value. Also, they were the first to cherish a government of law and not a government of man, as Aristotle wrote once. However, as the American philosopher Leonard Peikoff emphasized, individualism was not a characteristic of Greek arrangement because they have not set limits to the state. The most notorious case of this tendency to tyranny was the trial of Socrates, sent to death because he was found guilty of both corrupting the minds of the youth of Athens and for not believing in the gods of the state. For this reason, eventually, populism, demagogy, and the rule of majority against individual rights led Athens to decadence, as we see today also in most of the modern democracies. So, could you speak Greek as the language of liberty? Well, if they had restrained the state, maybe we could be speaking in Greek right now. Since they haven't, Greek is not an option. If not Greek, what about Latin? Not a chance. Rome was a society based on collectivism, duty, and law. The seeds of fascism in Italy was not new when Mussolini came into power. Well, despite that, Latin was the language used to write Magna Carta, very first document to restrain the power of a despotic ruler, in this case King John from England. What about Dutch as possible language of liberty? Dutch could be the language of liberty if they were not conquered by Napoleon and the French. The interesting part of this history is the fact that English is the language of liberty because the Dutch from the House of Orange won the Glorious Revolution, supporting the Protestants against the Catholics when they disputed the throne of England in a bloody war. To help this helped definitely open the gate to the Enlightenment movement in Britain and elsewhere. For 2 centuries, after William of Orange and his sons revolted against Spain, the Dutch Republic was, according to some analysts, the first legitimate capitalist experience in history. They had the first full-time stock exchange. Amsterdam was the wealthiest trading city of the world. The Dutch had a leading role in the international trading business. They developed maritime routes worldwide and modernized warehouse and distribution hubs logistics. They also introduced innovation in the shipping, financial, and insurance industries. They had great influence in Great Britain and also in America with ideas of freedom and tolerance. Dutch could be a language of liberty as it was in the past. What about French? I can imagine French as a language of liberty, do you? No? Liberty never comes alone in France. You claim for liberté and you get a package which includes all égalité and fraternité. Or ask for liberty and you get equality and brotherhood all together. Actually, they insist in mixing Rousseau and Voltaire, which is impossible. They never decide which way to follow. It's more appealing Jean-Baptiste Colbert with its mercantilism, Napoleon with its dominance by force, Auguste Comte with positivism, or Robespierre with its terror. They never paid attention to the brilliant philosophers, economists, and politics they had, such as Frédéric Bastiat, Alexis de Tocqueville, Montesquieu, and Jean-Baptiste Say. What about Germans? Like the others? I don't think so. All those subjectivist, anti-reason philosophers like Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, Engels, and Marx gave support to communism, socialism, and Nazism. Why English is currently the language of liberty? Since Magna Carta, which, as I said before, was written in Latin in 1215, individual rights started to be considered a true value among the British. But only after the Glorious Revolution and the promulgation of the Bill of Rights in 1689, which was based mostly on John Locke's ideas, enlightenment flourished. Important philosophers and scientists were influenced by those ideas based on reason and a new view of the world concerning metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. The ideals of enlightenment, protecting individual rights and restraining government under a constitutional republic, was the dream of extraordinary men who fought against the country where these ideas came from, to put them in practice. Free to act and free from coercion. They establish a society based on reality, consciousness, reason, and individualism. A society where every man could find a shelter to escape from tyranny. A society where man used to be an end in itself. A society free to act and free from coercion. There is another reason why English should be the language of freedom. In summer, we have, for liberty, the word amagi. In Greek, eleftheria. In Latin, libertas. In Portuguese, liberdade. In Spanish, libertad. Italian, libertad. French, liberté. In Dutch, vrijheid. In Deutsch, Freiheit. But in English we have liberty and freedom. Well, in case we have any problem, at least we have a plan B. Thank you.
If you have any, you can hand your hand and I go to you and give you the microphone.
Hi.
Hi.
Do you want? Okay.
Do you believe that English will remain the language of liberty?
Well, I have the last slide that I have I didn't broadcast it. But it's a very interesting slide where freedom in English, it's switched the is for the two cuneiform expressions that represent freedom in Chinese. So I don't know about if Chinese can be anytime or sometime the language of freedom. But, probably not, at least in the near future. But I think English, and mainly because the work of the Language of Liberty Institute can be still the language of liberty for me.
Any other questions?
You list a series of philosophers of other countries. How about Brazil? What philosophy you think that defend liberty in Brazil?
Well, actually, in Brazil, I think we have only second-hand philosophers.
Not
Actually-
in Brazil, but Brazilians.
Well, I don't know any.
I know one. How about Olavo de Carvalho?
Olavo de Carvalho is a second-hand.
Any other questions, guys? Yes, please introduce yourself.
Like, for the last 25 or 30 years, as I said before, what do you think we improve for liberty and freedom in Brazil or in the world? Or we are moving ourselves to a wrong way in economy of thinking? Or the economy are disturbing the liberty around countries and boundaries? So you was I study of liberty 25 years ago, so we are moving ourselves to a wrong way or in a good way?
Well, let me tell you my experience. The first seminar I organized to speak about liberty, it was in 1986. And there were more people in the stage than in the how do you say?
In the audience.
In the audience, okay? And the people that were in the audience were my relatives. So, this changed a lot. What do we see now? And this is obvious. The state is always behind the people. Always. So, we are seeing these tyrants governing us, but on the other hand, we see people fighting and spreading a lot the word of liberty, in Brazil included. In my time, when I started to participate of this movement, I was something out of question, you know. It was like five or six guys working alone, trying to spread the word of liberty, and everybody saw us as a crazy guys. Okay, now. For us at that time, put 50 people in a room was a dream, and it was not possible at that time. I think we can go. We can transform our society in a more free society, but if we wait for the government, it will never happen. Liberty comes from the society, not from the government. I think this is the answer.
Anyone else? You want to talk anything else, Roberto? Are you comfortable with that?
Well, I just want to thank you for you all for being here. Thank you, Gabriela, for inviting me too. And I'd like to thank you, people from the Language of Liberty Institute. It's a very, very nice job that you are doing. And I hope we can have you here all the time from now on. Okay? Thank you, Gabriela.